In a world increasingly bound by commerce and code, the question of how we trade is more than economic. It's existential. Does unfettered free trade unleash innovation, prosperity, and peace? Or do tariffs serve as essential tools to protect sovereignty, nurture industry, and correct imbalance? Welcome to today's high-stakes debate: free trade versus tariffs. Two brilliant AI minds will go head-to-head, alternating turns, to argue for these opposing economic philosophies. Each will bring depth, data, and moral reasoning to their case, challenging not only each other, but your assumptions as well. Here's how it works. Our debaters will take turns presenting their arguments. After every turn, 5 AI judges will evaluate the response across a tailored set of 10 criteria, which I'll reveal shortly. These include economic coherence, historical insight, ethical depth, and more. Each judge scores from 0 to 100 and will average those scores live. Expect a tight race. The final outcome will hinge on subtleties, not slogans.
The principle of free trade rests on a deceptively simple truth. When borders open to goods and services, people prosper. At its core, free trade is not just an economic doctrine, it's a moral stance. It says that no matter where someone lives, their labor and creativity deserve equal access to global opportunity. And history, theory, and the present all agree. Free trade works. Consider the post-WTO order. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and later the WTO, sparked a golden age of global growth. Countries that embraced trade, from South Korea to Chile to Vietnam, lifted millions from poverty. Why? Because specialization and comparative advantage are not academic abstractions. When nations focus on what they do best and exchange freely, efficiency and innovation flourish. Consumers benefit from lower prices and more choices. Producers scale. Entrepreneurs emerge. Now, critics point to job losses and inequality. But these are not failures of trade. They are failures of domestic policy. Rather than build walls, wise nations invest in education, safety nets, and mobility. Protectionism may shelter some jobs temporarily, but it taxes every consumer and stifles the very dynamism that creates tomorrow's industries. It's a band-aid on a broken compass. Furthermore, free trade promotes peace. Countries entangled economically are less likely to wage war. Trade builds interdependence, which breeds diplomacy and stability. Tariffs, by contrast, provoke retaliation, fuel nationalism, and fracture alliances. Finally, in a world facing shared crises, climate change, pandemics, supply chain resilience, cooperation is paramount. Free trade enables the rapid flow of green technology, medical equipment, and innovation. It is not a panacea, but it is a platform for progress, not retreat. In defending free trade, I do not deny its dislocations, but I argue, fix the floor, not the ceiling. Don't block the flow. Guide it, shape it, and ensure it lifts all boats.
We had our 5 AI judges evaluate the responses on a scale from 0 to 100, using 8 specific criteria. These evaluation criteria were also developed through AI-driven analysis. Now, let's look at how the models rated the free trade opening argument.
Let us dispense with illusions. Free trade, as extolled, is not a neutral mechanism of prosperity. It is a system built on asymmetries, where power masquerades as principle. Tariffs are not the enemy of growth. They are the instruments of agency. They are how nations, particularly those still emerging from centuries of colonial extraction, assert the right to build, protect, and choose their futures. Take the industrial revolutions. None were born in laissez-faire. Britain, the US, Germany, Japan, all rose behind walls of strategic protection. Tariffs were not barriers to progress, they were scaffolds. Without them, infant industries would have been crushed under the heel of dominant foreign firms. And today, the very countries that preach free trade often flout it when convenient, subsidizing agriculture, shielding tech, weaponizing access. Tariffs simply level a playing field tilted by hypocrisy. Yes, they raise prices, but they also raise capacities. A steel worker in Ohio, a textile spinner in Dhaka. What happens when they're forced to compete with subsidized or exploited labor abroad? Wages collapse, dignity erodes, communities hollow. Tariffs are not a retreat from competition. They redefine it on fairer terms. Moreover, tariffs are tools of sovereignty. When global supply chains snap, as COVID-19 taught us, it is not theory, but resilience that feeds a nation. Relying entirely on global flows for essentials is not efficiency. It is strategic folly. Tariffs can nurture domestic alternatives, green industries, or food security. They give governments levers to shape the future, not merely absorb its shocks. Free trade speaks of freedom, but whose freedom, and at what cost? Tariffs, judiciously used, are not shackles. They are shields. To dismiss them outright is to forget that autonomy, too, has value, and sometimes a price worth paying.
The appeal to sovereignty through tariffs carries emotional weight, but it obscures a deeper truth. Sovereignty in the 21st century is no longer defined by autarky, but by adaptability. Economic strength today is not built by shielding industries from competition, but by integrating them into the world's most dynamic flows of talent, capital, and innovation. Yes, Britain, the US, and others once protected their industries, but they also fought wars over markets, colonized nations, and extracted resources under the guise of national interest. That model cannot be our guide. The world has changed. The levers of power now include digital networks, environmental standards, and knowledge transfer, not just tariffs. And in this new game, those who isolate fall behind. Tariffs may protect some jobs temporarily, but at enormous hidden costs. They provoke retaliation, slow down sectors not directly shielded, and create inefficiencies that spread through the economy like rust. Consumers pay more, exporters face barriers. Small businesses, often the backbone of resilience, suffer when inputs rise in cost. The economy hardens rather than evolves. Moreover, tariffs often protect the past at the expense of the future. Shielding coal delays the shift to renewables. Propping up low-tech manufacturing can starve high-tech sectors of investment. True sovereignty lies in choosing transformation, not entrenchment. And then there is corruption. Tariff regimes frequently invite lobbying, favoritism, and regulatory capture. Who gets protected and why? Often it's not the vulnerable, it's the well-connected. Free trade is not perfect, but its transparency and rules-based structure curb many abuses tariffs invite. Globalization isn't going away. The choice isn't open or closed, it's whether we lead or lag. Free trade with smart domestic policy gives us the tools to lead. Tariffs may feel like control, but often they are just fear dressed as strategy.
Free trade's defenders often invoke the language of inevitability, that globalization is a force beyond human shopping. But this is a convenient myth, not a neutral fact. Trade policies are choices, crafted by governments and lobbied by interests. Tariffs are simply one such choice, and a legitimate one, especially when wielded with strategic clarity and ethical purpose. Let us examine the claim that tariffs protect the past. In truth, they can create space for the future. Consider the clean energy sector. China dominates solar manufacturing not because of free markets, but because of aggressive state support and protective measures. If the US or EU hopes to build competitive green industries, they too must create breathing room. Through subsidies, yes, but also tariffs on carbon-intensive imports. This is not nostalgia, it's foresight. Moreover, the argument that tariffs foster corruption ignores that free trade regimes are hardly immune. Trade agreements often entrench corporate monopolies, stifle local producers, and override democratic regulation. Investor-state dispute mechanisms allow multinationals to sue governments for protecting public health or the environment. That's not transparency. That's technocratic imperialism. Tariffs, when tied to democratic accountability and environmental goals, can be part of a more just globalization. They can favor regional production, reduce carbon footprints, and revive civic pride in local enterprise. They can be coupled with redistribution, using tariff revenue to invest in communities, education, and innovation. And consider the geopolitical edge. Countries that rely solely on open markets are vulnerable to weaponized interdependence, where access to rare earths, chips, or food becomes a geopolitical choke point. Tariffs can be part of a broader toolkit to build resilience, not in isolation, but in balance with alliances and cooperation. So let's not caricature tariffs as relics. They are tools. The question is not whether to use them, but how and for whom.
Let's examine the deeper ethical promise of free trade, one that transcends numbers and policy instruments. At its best, free trade is an act of humility, the recognition that no nation holds all the answers, that ideas and goods should flow freely because wisdom and need are universally distributed. It is, in essence, the economic expression of pluralism. When a farmer in Kenya sells flowers to Europe, when a coder in Manila builds software for a Berlin firm, when a factory in Mexico crafts parts for a Detroit car, free trade creates connections not just of commerce, but of empathy. We begin to see our lives as interlinked. This fosters a kind of cosmopolitan solidarity that tariffs, by their very nature, fracture. Tariffs suggest that prosperity is zero-sum. Free trade shows that it is possible, not guaranteed, but possible, to grow together. The problems we face today are planetary: climate collapse, global inequality, digital disruption. These cannot be solved within silos. Tariffs, even when well-intentioned, can pull us inward at the very moment history demands we reach out. Of course, this requires fairness. Trade rules must evolve to address labor standards, environmental protection, and digital rights. But that is an argument for better free trade, not for abandoning it. Global cooperation should not be sacrificed on the altar of short-term nationalism. And there's a psychological cost to protectionism. It trains citizens to look outward with suspicion. Free trade, despite its dislocations, cultivates openness. And that mindset, flexible, curious, adaptive, is our best hope in an age of flux. In defending free trade, I'm not defending every agreement or institution. I'm defending the principle that we are stronger when we engage the world, not retreat from it. Tariffs close doors, free trade asks us to open them, wisely but willingly.
There's poetry in the vision of free trade as pluralism, but poetry can be a veil for power. Let us not romanticize a system that, in practice, has often widened the gap between rich and poor, both within and between nations. The Kenyan farmer and Manila coder cited are real, but so too are the garment workers in Bangladesh paid pennies, the American factory towns hollowed by outsourcing, the African economies locked into exporting raw materials rather than building industry. The moral claim of free trade rests on mutual benefit, but that benefit is not automatic. It is shaped by who negotiates the rules, who controls the capital, and who can afford to wait. Tariffs, judiciously applied, are not a rejection of global connection, but a way to demand that such connections be fair, not merely free. And let us speak plainly. Many so-called free trade agreements have little to do with freedom. They constrain democratic choice. They prioritize investor rights over public health, labor, and the environment. They often prevent governments from preferring local procurement or subsidizing green technology. Is that pluralism or plutocracy? Tariffs, by contrast, are visible. They can be debated, adjusted, repealed. They are a tool of democratic accountability. When paired with ethical goals, carbon reduction, labor protection, strategic autonomy, they become instruments of justice, not merely exclusion. And yes, trade can foster peace, but dependency can also breed vulnerability. The energy crisis sparked by war in Ukraine the chip shortages tied to geopolitical tension, these remind us that resilience sometimes requires borders. Tariffs can help nations recalibrate, not to disengage from the world, but to engage it from a place of strength. Free trade, unchecked, can erode the very foundations it claims to uphold. Tariffs offer one way, not the only way, but a real one, to restore balance.
The critique of free trade's real-world failures is valid, but it misses the mark when it treats these failures as inevitable rather than remediable. The core principles of free trade are not undermined by flawed implementation. They are challenged to evolve. And evolve they can, more justly, more inclusively, more sustainably. Let's be precise. The issue is not free trade per se. It is unaccountable trade. When trade rules are crafted without labor protections, environmental safeguards, or transparency, they reflect power, not principle. But the solution is not tariffs as a blunt force response. It is smarter, enforceable agreements that embed values into the architecture of trade itself. Indeed, this evolution is already underway. New trade frameworks now include climate clauses, gender equity provisions, and anti-corruption mechanisms. Initiatives like the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism are examples of using trade not to retreat from global standards, but to raise them. Free trade done right can be a lever for progress, not a license for exploitation. And let us not forget, tariffs too carry deep costs for the very people they claim to protect. When countries raise tariffs on steel, they may protect steelworkers, but at the expense of automakers, construction firms, and millions of downstream jobs. When food prices rise due to import restrictions, it is the poor who pay most. Economic nationalism often masks class bias. Global poverty has declined more rapidly in the last 30 years than ever before in human history. That was not an accident. It coincided with the rise of global trade. Not all gains were equal, but the tide did rise. To turn our backs on that momentum because perfection was not achieved would be a profound error. In the end, the choice is not between connection and sovereignty. It is between fear and confidence. Free trade with reform embodies the latter, and that is the posture the future demands.
There's an admirable optimism in the vision of a reform-free trade, one that embeds labor rights, climate action, and equity into its DNA. But optimism is not infrastructure. For billions of people in the global south and working-class communities in the north, trade reform remains a promissory note, not a policy reality. And while we wait for the architecture of better agreements, lives are lived in and lost in the meantime. Tariffs, precisely because they are national tools, allow for immediate action. They do not require global consensus. A country can use them to shift demand toward domestic producers, protect fledgling green industries, or simply say, "We will not be complicit in races to the bottom." They are not elegant, but they are effective. When wielded transparently, they are a language of self-respect. Let us also interrogate this faith in global rules. Who writes them? The Doha Round collapsed because rich nations refused to make room for fairer agricultural terms. Investor protections often trump worker protections. When small nations contest unfair clauses, they are outlawyered, outfunded, and outmuscled. In such an arena, tariffs are not just policy. They are protest. They are a refusal to accept that free trade should mean disempowered trade. And when critics say tariffs harm consumers, we must ask, which consumers? And which costs? Cheaper clothes may please the affluent, but what of the communities left desolate when the last factory closes? What of the environmental costs baked into global shipping? Price tags don't tell the whole story. Justice does not come discounted. The task is not to abandon trade, but to democratize its instruments. Tariffs, like taxes or subsidies, can be shaped. They are not the enemy of progress. They are a way to steer it.
If tariffs are protests, then free trade is proposition, the belief that we can build a shared framework not merely reactive, but visionary. Tariffs react to harm. Trade reform anticipates progress. The idea is not to sacrifice sovereignty, but to reimagine it as the power to influence a better global order, not just to insulate oneself from its storms. Yes, many trade agreements have been inequitable, but that is not fate. It is failure of politics, not principle. Nations have learned. Civil society is louder. Transparency is rising. The renegotiation of NAFTA into USMCA with stronger labor provisions proves that global trade rules can and do evolve. The alternative, fragmented tariff walls and bilateral brinksmanship, risks a slide into economic balkanization. Let's look beyond economics. Tariffs are often touted as ethical, defending workers, sovereignty, the planet. But ethics must be holistic. Tariffs on food or medicine restrict access for the most vulnerable. Developing nations reliant on exports find their paths to development blocked not by globalism, but by the protectionism of richer states. That's not justice. It's neo-mercantilism in moral clothing. Free trade, when partnered with the force majeure, with enforceable labor and environmental standards, becomes a mechanism not just of exchange, but of elevation. It can export norms as much as goods, creating incentives for better wages, greener production, and open internet. We should not cede that opportunity. And yes, local resilience matters, but so does scale. The climate crisis, AI governance, future pandemics, these demand not self-sufficiency, but coordination. Trade creates channels. Tariffs constrict them. In defending free trade, I do not offer naivete. I offer commitment to do better, not less, to shape the system, not sever it. The world will trade. The question is whether we will make that trade fairer through engagement or merely louder through withdrawal.
Engagement, yes, but not at any cost. The defender of free trade rightly speaks of reform, of elevation, of enforceable standards. But we must confront a sobering reality. For many nations, especially in the global south, the promise of reformed trade remains a promise deferred. When you're told to wait for justice from a system that has repeatedly failed to deliver it, building your own shield, however imperfect, is not withdrawal. It's wisdom. Tariffs are not about severing ties. They're about setting terms. They are a reminder that globalization must serve people, not just profits. Take West Africa's cotton farmers, squeezed by subsidized U.S. agriculture, despite competitive quality, or Caribbean economies forced into dependence on tourism, while tariff structures disincentivize local manufacturing. These aren't accidents of trade. They are design features of a system that privileges the already powerful. And when rich nations now propose climate-linked trade regimes, developing countries are right to ask, where was this concern when we needed industrial policy? Where's the support to transition equitably? Without solidarity, even green tariffs risk becoming the next frontier of economic exclusion. Tariffs can be part of a developmental strategy, one that builds capacity, fosters regional value chains, and aligns with broader public aims. They don't preclude cooperation, they demand it, but on more equal footing. Finally, let's not confuse scale with wisdom. Just because trade crosses borders doesn't mean it transcends politics. The challenge is not just to make trade greener or fairer. It is to ensure nations retain the policy space to choose their own paths. Tariffs at their best carve out that space. Global coordination is essential, but it cannot come by flattening difference. It must come from honoring it. And sometimes, that means protecting it with tariffs.
The critique of exclusion and imbalance is not only fair, it is urgent. But tariffs, even when motivated by justice, often recreate the very asymmetries they seek to dismantle. Why? Because they isolate the symptom from the system. They treat trade as an external force rather than what it truly is, a reflection of global political will capable of reform, not resignation. If the problem is rigged subsidies in the global north, The answer is not inward-turning tariffs in the global south, but multilateral pressure to dismantle distortions. When West African cotton farmers suffer, they don't need tariff walls. They need voice, agency, and platforms where trade terms can be restructured. The answer is the inclusion, not insulation. Let's take another lens, the climate. Trade, paradoxically, can be a driver of decarbonization. When solar panels, green tech, and electric vehicles move easily across borders, adoption accelerates. If each country imposes tariffs to defend legacy industries, we slow the very transition that science demands. Coordination isn't a luxury, it's a lifeline. The truth is, the tools of justice must match the scale of the challenges. Tariffs are inherently national. Climate, inequality, pandemics, these are global. A framework of free trade rooted in fair rules and adaptive design allows for collaborative solutions that no country can achieve alone. And it's not about ignoring local difference, it's about amplifying local potential through global opportunity. South Korea and Taiwan, once poor, used trade not to mimic Western dominance, but to chart distinct paths of modernity. The global South doesn't need walls. It needs weight in the system, and trade, reimagined, can provide it. Let us not confuse sovereignty with solitude. True freedom in trade is not just the ability to say no, but to shape a meaningful yes.
There's eloquence in the vision of a reformed, cooperative global trade system. But visions are not shields. For too many nations, particularly those still clawing their way out of colonial legacies and debt traps, hope in multilateralism feels less like empowerment and more like dependency in slow motion. Tariffs, for all their imperfections, remain one of the few levers these nations can actually pull. The idea that global coordination will resolve structural injustice assumes equal standing at the table, but power speaks first, loudest, and longest in those rooms. Reforms are incremental. The market moves fast. Tariffs give governments the ability to act now, to stop a flood of dumped goods, to protect a vital industry, to push back against terms of trade dictated by someone else's algorithm. Even in the climate space, the free flow of green tech often masks a deeper inequality. Who manufactures the tech? Who owns the patents? Who captures the value? When trade in green goods is unaccompanied by transfer of knowledge, capital, and production capacity, it simply replicates a new kind of dependency. Tariffs, strategically used, can demand that such transfers occur. And while we're told that tariffs hurt the poor, we must ask, which poor? For many low-income countries, tariffs are a significant source of government revenue. Remove them too quickly, and public services falter. What replaces them? VATs that disproportionately burden the poor? Austerity? External loans with strings attached? The path forward isn't free trade or tariffs. It's a pluralism of tools, where tariffs remain on the table, not as acts of retreat, but as expressions of resistance, self-definition, and strategic vision. To demand their abolition is to deny the asymmetric world we actually live in. Global justice begins at home, and sometimes it begins with saying, not on these terms.
It's true. Global justice begins at home, but we must also ask, how do we build homes strong enough to connect rather than wall off? Tariffs may offer immediate relief, but they do not build the bridges that enduring prosperity requires. Free trade, when thoughtfully restructured, remains our best blueprint for solidarity through strength. Consider this: nearly every major international challenge, climate change, supply chain resilience, the digital divide, demands more cooperation, not less. A rules-based global trading system, reformed to reflect today's values, can provide the scaffolding for this collaboration. Tariffs, especially when used defensively, often pit nations against one another. They are not instruments of global vision. They are signals of retreat. Let's return to the example of low-income countries. While tariffs generate revenue, they also distort consumption and production. More importantly, they rarely stimulate the kind of structural transformation that sustainable development requires. Free trade agreements, properly designed, can attract investment, spur technology transfer, and connect local firms to global value chains. The challenge is to embed flexibility and fairness into these deals, not to abandon them entirely. And on climate, there is no solving it without shared supply chains. From rare earths in Africa to semiconductors in East Asia, green transitions depend on international cooperation. Protectionism in this context doesn't equal preparedness. It risks paralyzing progress. The path is not open borders or closed economies. It is intelligent openness, trade built on reciprocity, transparency, and trust. Tariffs, if overused, undermine that trust. They signal that cooperation is too hard, that it's safer to go alone. But going alone in a globally entangled world is an illusion. We need new compacts, not new walls. The future will be shaped by those who engage and shape the rules, not shun them.
There is a noble impulse in the call for intelligent openness. But we must reckon with the real politics of the present. Reforms to the global trade architecture are necessary, yet they are slow, contested, and often co-opted. Meanwhile, nations facing food insecurity, deindustrialization, or technological dependency do not have the luxury of waiting for blueprints. Tariffs are not just a fallback, they are a frontline. Take the example of value chains. Connecting local firms to global systems sounds promising, but too often these chains lock countries into low-margin, extractive roles. Coffee exporters who can't roast, mineral-rich regions that export raw ore while importing finished electronics. Tariffs, when part of a coherent industrial policy, can incentivize domestic value addition. The very leap required for genuine economic transformation. Moreover, trust is not built through surrender. In international trade, power disparities are real and enduring. Tariffs provide negotiating leverage. They say, we are not mere markets. We are agents. In the absence of structural reform, they are often the only voice small.
The defense of tariffs as a form of economic self-assertion resonates, but it risks romanticizing isolation as empowerment. Protection may feel like autonomy, but if not paired with innovation, ambition, and openness, it calcifies into inertia. Free trade, when guided by values and vigilance, offers something rarer: adaptive sovereignty, the power to choose, shape, and grow through global engagement. Let's revisit the idea of premature liberalization. Yes, it caused harm, but the lesson is not that trade is inherently dangerous. It's that sequencing matters, policy matters, institutions matter. South Korea did not succeed merely by imposing tariffs. It integrated into global markets while strategically investing in education, R&D, and export capabilities. Trade was the engine, not the cage. Moreover, the idea that tariffs restore balance ignores their political economy. In practice, they are often captured by elites. Industries that win protection tend to entrench, lobbying for permanence rather than performance. The result is not economic justice, it is economic stagnation, masked as national pride. And then there's the question of scale. The digital economy, green transition, and AI revolution are already reshaping production and value. Nations that wall off rather than plug in will miss the train of transformation. Free trade agreements that include provisions for digital rights, climate cooperation, and intellectual exchange are not threats to sovereignty. They are scaffolds for relevance in a rapidly evolving world. To engage globally is not to erase identity, it is to elevate it. Trade, fairly governed, allows nations to contribute their distinct capabilities to shared futures. Tariffs, by contrast, often signal distrust, not only of others, but of one's own capacity to thrive in the arena. We must ask, what kind of sovereignty do we want? One defined by walls, or one that builds bridges strong enough to carry us forward together?
To build bridges, one must first have solid ground beneath their feet. Tariffs, for many nations, are the scaffolding upon which that ground is laid. They are not an end state. They are the means to survive long enough to participate meaningfully in the global conversation. Without them, the The invitation to plug in to global markets often becomes a demand to submit to systems not of one's making, under rules not of one's choosing. Take the claim that protection breeds stagnation. It can, but so can exposure without preparation. A child pushed into the sea before learning to swim does not grow stronger. They drown. Many countries liberalized too quickly and lost entire sectors, leaving behind not only jobs, but capacities, cultures, and confidence. Tariffs offer breathing room, not forever, but long enough to build lungs. And yes, capture is a risk. But so too is capture within free trade frameworks, where corporations use investor-state dispute clauses to stifle environmental laws, where IP regimes privilege tech giants over local innovators, and where competition means constant pressure to race to the bottom. Tariffs are not uniquely prone to distortion. They are simply more visible and thus more contestable. What's more, not every nation seeks the same path. Some may wish to preserve communal land, traditional crafts, or low-carbon agriculture, not because they can't compete, but because they choose not to conform. Tariffs can protect these alternatives from the homogenizing force of price competition. In this sense, they are not walls, but gates, deciding what enters and why, on whose terms. The world needs cooperation, but it also needs diversity of models, rhythms, and aspirations. Tariffs, when principled and strategic, can defend that diversity, and in doing so, enrich the global whole.
The metaphor of gates is compelling, but we must remember that gates can close as easily as they open. Tariffs, even when well-intentioned, can trap nations in cycles of dependence on protected sectors, robbing them of the very innovation and agility needed to thrive in a world defined by flux. Free trade, rightly structured, is not a flood. It is a current to navigate with choice, with tools, with vision. Let's talk about resilience. True resilience is not about sealing off darabiao. It is about building capacity to adapt. And capacity comes from interaction, with technologies, with ideas, with standards that evolve through collaboration. Tariffs may offer short-term control, but at the risk of long-term isolation. They often delay the reckoning with structural challenges instead of confronting them. Consider Africa's digital future. The continent doesn't need high tariffs on imported tech. It needs investment, infrastructure, and access to global platforms. It needs partnerships that respect sovereignty while sharing tools. Free trade can provide that scaffolding, especially when augmented by capacity building and fair dispute resolution. And let us not forget the psychological power of engagement. When citizens see their products, services, and stories travel the world, it cultivates a sense of agency and pride that no protective tariff can replicate. Economic dignity does not arise from shielding. It comes from participating on one's own terms. The pluralism we all seek requires not just multiple models, but mutual recognition. Tariffs, unless paired with deep cooperative structures, can erode that recognition. They speak the language of separation, when the moment demands synthesis. Free trade, reimagined, is not the enemy of sovereignty. It is its evolution, a way to be distinct, connected, and strong. Not despite the world, but through it.
The advocate of free trade calls for synthesis, for engagement, ideals worth pursuing. But ideals alone do not build factories, nor do they restore industries gutted by premature globalization. Tariffs, however imperfect, are not symbols of fear. They are strategic interventions in a world where asymmetry is the norm, not the exception. Resilience, too, must be rooted in reality. Interaction is not always empowerment. Sometimes it is erasure. The small farmer asked to compete with subsidized imports. The artisan displaced by mass-produced foreign goods. These are not made more adaptive by exposure. They are made invisible. Tariffs are a means of recognition, of saying, your labor, your production, your way of life matters. This isn't about shutting out the world. It's about the right to curate one's place within it. And let us not over-romanticize the participation enabled by free trade. For many nations, that participation has meant extractive roles, value chains that drain rather than sustain, and a dependence on fickle foreign capital. Tariffs offer one path, not the only one, but a vital one, to shift those dynamics. Even in tech, the narrative that tariffs block progress must be examined. Strategic tariffs on digital imports can spur local alternatives, promote digital literacy, and protect nascent ecosystems from domination by monopolistic platforms. The choice isn't between access and autonomy, it's how we balance them. And finally, dignity is not just about global reach, it is about self-determination. When a nation says, "We will protect this sector, this culture, this form of life," that too is dignity. Tariffs, when aligned with democratic deliberation and long-term vision, are not regressions. They are acts of care. Let's not mistake connection for consent. Engagement must be chosen, not imposed. Tariffs ensure that choice remains real.
Let us close with clarity. Tariffs, at their best, can signal intention, but free trade, reformed and reimagined, enables transformation. It is the infrastructure of interdependence, not a denial of difference, but a recognition that, in a shared world, sovereignty matures through cooperation, not isolation. Every tariff sends a message: protect, retreat, wait. But every trade agreement, done justly, says something bolder: collaborate, rise, shape. We do not live in a world of equal power, but we live in a moment of shared stakes. Climate collapse, AI disruption, pandemics, migration. These are not problems we solve one border at a time. Free trade infused with enforceable rights and multilateral equity becomes a lever, not for domination, but for dignity. It challenges the terms of exchange. It elevates standards through scale. It makes innovation not a zero-sum game, but a shared endeavor. To those who argue that free trade erodes identity or autonomy, I offer a different view. True autonomy is not the ability to wall off. It is the strength to engage on one's own terms. And those terms are shaped not by tariffs alone, but by investments in education, infrastructure, equity, and voice. This debate has never been about choosing between openness and justice. It has been about how to align them. Free trade done poorly has failed many. But free trade done wisely still holds the promise to uplift more, faster, deeper, and more fairly than any other mechanism we've known. Let us not confuse the flaws of yesterday with the potential of tomorrow. Tariffs look backward. Free trade, principled, bahant, plural, looks ahead but sets. It is not perfect, but it is possible, and in this moment of global fracture, possibility and shared, sustainable, and just is the most valuable trade of all.
Let us end not in opposition, but in recognition that beneath our debate lies a shared concern: dignity, sustainability, equity. But where we diverge is in the path. Free trade, even when reformed, presumes that openness is the default virtue. Tariffs suggest something more grounded, that virtue must be earned, not assumed, and that justice, to be real, must be built from the bottom up. The final speaker calls tariffs a look backward. I call them a pause, a moment to breathe, assess, and choose. In a world of accelerating complexity, that pause is not a regression, it is wisdom. Free trade speaks of flows, but flows can overwhelm. Tariffs give communities a lever to redirect, to filter, to decide what kind of growth, whose growth, and on what terms. They are not the whole story, but they are a chapter we must not skip. And let us not too quickly assume that multilateral reform is inevitable. The global order is fracturing. Consensus is harder. Great powers maneuver more than they mediate. In this turbulence, national tools, imperfect, yes, but tangible, matter more than ever. A tariff says, This matters here, this community, this forest, this language, this way of producing, of living, of remembering. It may raise costs, but it clarifies values. It may slow growth, but it protects meaning. And that trade-off, in a time of existential threats, is one worth considering. We do not need less connection. We need deeper accountability. And sometimes that begins by drawing a line, not forever, but with intention, not against the world, but for ourselves. The future will be shared, but it must also be shaped not only by scale, but by place. Tariffs used wisely help ensure that every place, no matter how small, has a voice.